Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's Medical Center Hour, a program called Your Heart is the Size of Your Fist. A doctor reflects on 10 years in a refugee clinic. This is a program that today doubles as Department of Medicine Grand Rounds as well. And we have another co-sponsor that I will mention toward the end of my introduction. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, and it's our center that brings you these weekly Medical Center Hours through much of the academic year. We're delighted to see all of you here today. We're especially delighted that today is beautiful weather because this is actually Martina Scholtens' second visit to UVA, her first one having been, unfortunately, snowed out last March. War and political strife, traumatic persecution, natural disasters, poverty, and hope for a better life have made migration a fact of life for legions of people in our world. Leave-taking, border crossing, culture change, and resettlement bring challenges and hardships that affect individual and family health over both the short and long term. What is the experience of health professionals whose everyday clinical practice involves witnessing refugees' struggles and helping them to bridge a troubled past for a hopeful future? For 10 years, family doctor Martina Scholtens worked at a government-sponsored clinic that followed refugees through the first year of their new lives in Vancouver, British Columbia. This Moore lecture is based on her book, Your Heart is the Size of Your Fist, a creative nonfiction account of one Iraqi family's first year in Canada. Martina Scholtens' memoir offers insights into how she cared for persons whose lives and stories were so very different from her own, and also how she acknowledged her patients' suffering, managed to balance medicine and motherhood, and not least, cared for herself. Our annual Moore Lecture is funded from an endowment held in the university's Medical Alumni Association. It's funding from an alumnus's family, which enables us to celebrate and learn from physicians who write, and who, through their writing, provide important insights into doctoring and healing. Their insights are valued by students and trainees and colleagues, but also by the public, a public that includes patients, all of whom are intensely curious to know who their doctors really are. We thank our co-sponsors today, the Department of Medicine, again, whose grand rounds this is, and the medical school's Generalist Scholars Program and its celebration of Primary Care Week. You can also thank the Generalist Scholars for the primary care apples they will provide outside the auditorium when you leave the upstairs entrance. You can also get yourself a copy of Dr. Scholtens' wonderful book from UVA Bookstore located right outside, and she's also happy to sign books following the program. And again, I mentioned that Martina Scholtens came last March and was all ready to do a program at Medical Center Hour that was a part of the Virginia Festival of the Book, and lo and behold, we had enough snow that UVA closed. And all the book festival programs at UVA that day closed as well. So we are thrilled to have her back, and we're happy that Hurricane Florence didn't get in the way, at least of her visit. So welcome, Martina Scholtens.
Thank you. I'm grateful to Marcia and Danny for inviting me back. I'm grateful to the Moore family for supporting this lecture, and I'm especially grateful that the campus doesn't look like it did at my last visit in March. So let's start with just a bit of context, looking at the Canadian refugee system as it relates to the US. So the United States continues to be the world leader in terms of absolute number of refugees resettled per year, despite significant decreases over the last couple of years. But when you look at refugee resettlement in terms of per capita resettlement, it's Canada that is the world leader, with 725 refugees resettled per million citizens, versus last year 102 per million in the US. Second, Canada over the last couple of years has seen an enormous surge in the number of refugee claimants. And this is due in large part to decisions made south of our border. And this is a sampling of typical headlines that you see in Canadian newspapers over the last couple of years. This is a photo that accompanied one of those headlines. I love this photo because I think it is completely saturated with Canadian stereotypes. We've got the snow drifts, there's a Mountie, I count 2 toques, there's a cap that looks like it's made of a beaver pelt, and then we have this kind of warm embrace of refugees. And this is a Somali family crossing the border into Quebec last year. And the refugee situation in Canada is not quite this idyllic, but Canada does have a long history of a welcoming attitude towards refugees. And Canada is unique in the world in that it's had a private refugee sponsorship system in existence since 1979. And as a Canadian citizen over the age of 18, you can form what's called a group of 5, where you connect with 4 friends or coworkers or neighbors, and you can select a refugee family and commit to bringing them to Canada and supporting them practically and socially and financially for their first year in the country. So I think a program like this kind of reinforces the country's general attitude towards refugees. I worked at Bridge Refugee Clinic, as Marcia said, in Vancouver for over 10 years. Bridge Clinic was the only refugee clinic in the province of British Columbia. We saw 1,000 to 2,000 new patients a year from around the world, most from United Nations refugee camps. And so a typical day at the clinic might start like this. 9 o'clock, a Syrian human rights activist tells me serenely, "When I was in prison for 5 years, they took my wallet, my health, and my freedom, but they couldn't take away my message." 9:30, the parents of an autistic Iranian teen are overjoyed that in Canada, he attends school. The dad shows me a video clip on his phone of the school musical, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. "I didn't understand it," he says, pointing out his son in an Oompa Loompa costume, "but I loved it." 10 o'clock, an asylum seeker who was jailed in China for practicing Falun Gong weeps as he recounts the torture that he endured. I document his scars for a medical legal report to the millimeter with a ruler. A day's work at the clinic didn't feel complete to me unless I captured something of what was memorable that day in writing. There was so much that was beautiful or funny or moving that I worried that if I didn't snag some of it as it rushed by, that it would be lost. And so I wrote, first of all, simply to remember. And then I began to write to try to make sense of those things that I found difficult. And most days on my way home from work, I wrestled with some kind of contradiction. And I found things difficult like being exposed to how humans treat each other around the world, or this disparity in wealth between the patients at the clinic and those who worked there, or being invited to a patient's birthday party and wondering where the boundaries were. The word essay comes from the French to try, and writing was a way to try to make sense of those things. Both the writing to remember and the writing to try were for my own benefit and pleasure. I wrote because I wanted to, not because I thought I should. But then a couple of years ago, I attended a narrative medicine conference, and American physician writer Louise Aronson said that physicians ought to write, that we have a triple obligation to patient, to profession, and to society. And she said that we ought to write to memorialize the patient, to reflect on the work of doctoring, and to advocate for what our patients need. And so that is what I've tried to do with my book, Your Heart is the Size of Your Fist, which is a creative nonfiction account of an Iraqi family's first year in Canada from my perspective as their physician. And so this afternoon, I'd like to talk about how with this book, I have tried to do the physician writer's work of reflection, memorialization, reflection, and advocacy. And I don't think that these three duties are exclusive to physicians. I think there's a wider application across healthcare and beyond. So if I use the term physician, it's simply in keeping with Aronson's remarks and with my own professional experience. We ought to write to memorialize our patients. What does memorialize mean? It means to honor or to remember. I would take this one step further and argue that in refugee medicine, I worked and wrote to legitimize my patients. I worked to legitimize their suffering and their status. And I did this, first of all, by bearing witness. Let me read just a couple of paragraphs from my book. The patient was a young Iraqi mother. When I asked her how she was doing, she spoke so quickly that Hani couldn't keep up with the interpretation. Suddenly, the patient stopped talking and dug in her purse for her phone. She stabbed at the screen with her index finger. She was going to show me a photo. I was sure of it. This often happened at the clinic, and I never knew what I was going to see. Sometimes it was an album documenting the progression of a rash. Once it was a picture of the patient in his previous life, standing in front of a grand home with an orange grove out front. And sometimes patients showed me something terrible, third-degree burns sustained during torture, or a crucifixion. She passed me her phone, the screen filled with an image of dead bodies in someone's home. I looked at the picture like it was my job, because it was. It was part of caring for this patient. Something didn't make sense, though, and I automatically did a finger spread, zooming in, only to realize that the bodies were mutilated. I handed the phone back to her, and she looked grimly satisfied. The visit ended soon after. She didn't need anything else. When I called Yusuf from the waiting room a half hour later, the young Iraqi mother was sitting on one of the benches, and she blew kisses at me with both hands. After telling me an awful story, patients always did one of two things. They either thanked me or they apologized. And after hearing a horrible story, I usually said some combination of three things. I'm sorry you've suffered so much. No one deserves to be treated like that. I want you to come back and see me. And it sounds like so little, but it seemed to be enough. And writing these stories down, it turns out, is another form of legitimization. And when I reached out to patients to ask their permission to have their stories included in the book, they all readily gave consent. And when I assured them that these stories would be anonymous, more than one insisted, please include my first and last name in your book. This work of legitimization through bearing witness is particularly difficult in refugee medicine because of the risk to the caregiver of vicarious traumatization. Vicarious trauma refers to the cumulative transformative effect of repeated stories of trauma on the caregiver, resulting in disrupted spirituality or worldview, and it can lead to hopelessness or despair. So if narrative medicine is the ability to recognize, elicit, absorb, interpret, and act on patient stories of illness, then I would argue that vicarious traumatization is what happens to the physician as reader when story after story is one of horror. Over my years at the clinic, I ran the gamut of responses to these stories that patients told me. So first there was an almost voyeuristic fascination with these awful details, which were so far removed from my own experience that they read like fiction. Then there was avoidance of patients' past when I became overwhelmed by my own powerlessness to change them. And there I was basically just skipping entire chapters. And then there was detachment, where I could hear a story of torture while noting that it was almost noon and thinking about what I was going to order from the deli for lunch. And there I was basically just skimming the passage. And eventually I had to learn to simply listen completely. These are some of my colleagues from the clinic. At one point, we had to have a psychologist brought into our staff meetings to talk to us about how to stay well. And this psychologist told us we needed to work on balancing our personal and professional lives, that we needed to offset our clinical caseload with other replenishing professional activities, and she suggested that we engage in political work for social change. So in short, medicine couldn't be all that we did. And we already knew that, and this was why none of the physicians at the clinic worked full-time. We knew we wouldn't last. The feedback I received from patients over the years had a recurring theme, which was that I was thanked never for being a doctor, but for being a fellow human. And after caring for an Iraqi man and his wife and their 3 medically complex children for over a year, he wrote me an email after I discharged them from the clinic to a family physician in their community. And this is part of the email. Our 4 children, they died because of the siege on Iraq and the lack of medicine before 2003 war. One day I visited Dr. Martina in the clinic. I love to take care of my appearance. In that time, I was not in my habit. I looked tired, and my beard, it was long, and my clothes were shabby. Dr. Martina, she asked me, what happened? For a few days ago, I can't sleep enough, I said. I'm sad because I'm far from my mother, who loved me a lot, and I feel nostalgic for my children, who they died, and missing them so much. I looked to the eyes of my doctor. I found it's red with tears. So of everything I'd done for this family, the investigations, the referrals, the prescriptions, the counseling, that is what stood out to him. Now, of course, I asked his permission to share that email, and he first said he'd think about it. And then he said, you can share that email during your talk. He said, but you have to include the part where you then refused the gift I tried to give you for upsetting you. And this is true. There's a narrow set of circumstances under which I'll accept a gift from a patient, but a gift of apology for moving me with a story is not one. My legitimization of patient suffering then held meaning, not because I was a doctor, but because I was a fellow human, and not just any human, a Canadian human. And I came to see that a fundamental need of my patients was to be recognized as a legitimate Canadian who belonged in our society. And it dawned on me at one point that while I called my patients refugees, they never referred to themselves as refugees. And I realized that I understood refugee to describe a category of person, but my patients understood refugee to describe a temporary set of circumstances. And so I made an effort to stop calling them refugees. And when I introduced a patient, I tried to say, rather than saying, please see this 50-year-old Somali refugee with chest pain, I tried to say, please see this 50-year-old Somali Canadian permanent resident with chest pain, comma, who arrived as a refugee 6 months ago. And patients noticed that I made that effort. So many of my patients were lonely and disconnected from their Canadian neighbors. One afternoon, I saw an Iraqi teenage girl, and at the end of the visit, I said, anything else I can do for you today? And she looked down and said, could you help me find some friends? Another time, I had a patient come in. He was a middle-aged Middle Eastern man, and he was very excited to tell me the story that had happened that week, where he had been grocery shopping in his neighborhood, And on the way home, the bottom fell out of one of the bags. And as he was scrambling to collect his groceries from the sidewalk, he heard a car honk, and it was his neighbor who gave him a ride home. And this gesture meant so much to my patient. And it wasn't the actual physical assistance that mattered, it was the fact that he had been acknowledged. And what my patients needed was friendship and not rescue. I had a book launch in September, and I invited all of those patients whose permission I had requested to include their stories in the book, and they all came. And this is one of those patients. I like that there's a maple leaf and a Syrian flag on his lapel. This man told me at the end of the evening that that was the best day he'd had in 10 years in Canada. And how can that be? This was a good party. It wasn't that good. But I know he was happy to have his story included in the book, because the next day he posted to Facebook pictures of the event and pictures of the passage about him in the book. But I think he was happier still to have been invited to a party with fellow Canadians on a Friday night. The second reason we ought to write to reflect on our profession. And for me, reflection always involves confession. And I have tried with this book to be honest about my own weaknesses and doubts and struggles. So why this emphasis on confession? F. Scott Fitzgerald said this: what people are ashamed of usually makes a good story. But when you're writing creative nonfiction, you can't very well write about what you think others ought to be ashamed of. William Bradley wrote this in his essay: if there's a villain in my creative nonfiction, it's got to be me. So I am the villain of this book. So these are my kids. If you're thinking that's an unreasonable number of kids to have, you're not alone. I think that every day. So I want to talk about how my reflections on how motherhood fits with writing and with medicine. So I worked part-time until my youngest started school 2 years ago. I stayed home a couple of days a week because I thought it was best for my family. I stayed home a couple of days a week because I needed respite from the refugee clinic. And I stayed home 2 days a week to think. In 1938, Brenda Euland wrote this in her book, If You Want to Write. How do creative thoughts come? They come in a slow way. It is the little bomb of revelation bursting inside you. The imagination needs long, inefficient, happy, idling, dawdling, and puttering. These people who are always briskly doing something have little, sharp, staccato ideas. But they have no slow, big ideas. And the fewer consoling, noble, shining, free, jovial, magnanimous ideas that come, the more nervously and desperately they rush and run from office to office, exam room to exam room, thinking by action at last to make life have some warmth and meaning. So my days at home with a baby were for a kind of idleness, and it was an attempt to live with wide margins. In her book, The Artist's Way, Julia Cameron discusses the importance of replenishing our creative resources. And she says, any regular, repetitive action primes the well. I learned to see the regular, repetitive, often menial tasks of motherhood as an opportunity to prime my creative well. Folding 24 onesies, rocking a baby to sleep, spooning applesauce into a tiny mouth, 1 teaspoon at a time. 2 days of this a week yielded good ideas. 3 days a week led to meagerness and rumination and depressive symptoms. So there's a fine line with these things. So every night before I go to bed, I make the rounds of my kids. And this action of tucking them in brings with it some powerful emotions. There's the deep affection for my kids. There's the satisfaction of having managed the day's problems. There's the responsibility as their mother. There's gratitude and humility for my position. And there's something familiar there. This response is remarkably similar to how I felt as a resident on the family medicine ward, walking down the corridor towards the call room at 11 at night, when the ward was hushed and still, and I walked past these rooms of 4 beds apiece with patients resting under those blue cotton blankets, and it was a feeling of I had brought my charges through another day. And it was the sense of having tucked the kids in for the night. Nurturing is a natural fit with medicine, and so are other qualities commonly considered maternal, although of course no more exclusive to women than paternal qualities are to men. Warmth, tenderness, the ability to comfort. My medical training at UBC emphasized avoiding paternalism, the misuse of physician authority to restrict the freedoms and responsibilities of patients in their supposed best interest. But maternalism was never mentioned, and it seemed to be understood to be benign. Thoreau said this: "Each thought that is welcomed and recorded is a nest egg, by the side of which more will be laid." So I wrote down that thought on the overlap of my maternal feelings at home and at work, and that thought was the nest egg. Then a couple of weeks later, after a patient encounter with a tiny elderly Bedouin woman with tribal markings on her face, the medical student sighed and said to me, "She was adorable." And I knew exactly what he meant, but the statement bothered me. And I'd run across the sentiment before in all sorts of contexts. I heard a mayor of a small town in BC talking about his constituents' frustration with delays in the private sponsorship system. And he said, "My constituents want their refugees by Christmas." And I read an article where a woman wrote about the family that her church had sponsored, a refugee family, and she said, "We are in love with this family. We are smitten." Refugees seem particularly able to inspire and amplify maternal feelings in those that work with them. And my theory is that this is because refugees often have childlike qualities. They usually, at the start, have difficulty communicating in English. They are initially dependent on others, and they tend to be deferential. And these features make them non-threatening and set up an automatic power differential, and helpers seem to swoop in. I wondered if this was a phenomenon that we might call maternalism, the misapplication of motherly sentiments that serve to infantilize the object of care. Maybe maternalism exerts power just as paternalism does, just more subtly. So I laid those thoughts next to the nest egg idea. And then I started thinking about an attitude that I often encountered outside of the clinic, which was the expectation that refugees act from a position of inferiority and obligation. At a party, I met a woman, and once she learned what I did for a living, she said, "Oh, we helped out a refugee family once. We let them stay in the suite over our garage for next to nothing." And I knew exactly what was coming next because I'd heard some variation of this so many times before. She went on, "They asked if our son could stop playing basketball in the driveway after 8 because it kept their baby awake." And the other people at this party just shook their head at the gall of that request, at this lack of proper gratitude. And someone else piped up and said, "Our church supported a refugee family for an entire year, and then they left for a Pentecostal church. And they didn't want to buy their clothes secondhand." Around that time, I came across an article that contrasted the helper to the helped. So when you're the helper, that action affirms your own capacity, worth, and superiority. But if you're the helped, that suggests deficiency, burden, and inferiority. Helping others is not necessarily altruistic. This article made me examine my own motivation for the work that I did. Was I drawn to care for marginalized populations because of a moral imperative? Or was it because the distinction between capable helper and deficient recipient was that much clearer? So I laid all of these thoughts beside the others, my own tiny bombs of revelation that went off while I swept the kitchen floor while the baby slept. And when I tied them all together, I had chapter 17 for my book. And finally, we ought to write to advocate for what our patients need. So what does advocacy through writing look like? It can take a number of different forms. It can look like this. So this is an opinion piece that I wrote for our provincial daily newspaper a couple of years ago in response to federal cuts to refugee health insurance. Now, my kids were extremely impressed when this appeared in the paper, and they took a copy to school to show their teachers and friends. And meanwhile, I was bracing myself for the pushback, because when you advocate for refugees, there is always pushback. And sure enough, the next day there were a number of letters to the editor in the paper about my article. And I thought my kids ought to see this other side of speaking up. So I sat them down and read these letters to them. And the letters said things like this: Dr. Martina Scholtens' May 5th op-ed is, to put it mildly, disgusting. Why are doctors like Dr. Scholtens fighting for free prescriptions for refugees? Why should BC improve health coverage for refugees? This is kind of distressing for my kids. And my oldest daughter, her jaw dropped, and she's like, "Oh, Mom, did anyone like it?" And I told her, this is not about being liked. This is about making people pay attention. And sure enough, the next day, our provincial health minister, Terry Lake, he did write in to respond. Now, he defended the status quo, and that was fine. I knew that change does not happen overnight, and bringing awareness to the issue was simply the first step. So advocacy through writing can also look like this. You can write and deliver a speech. So for several years running, I organized and spoke at rallies for healthcare workers in downtown Vancouver to protest those federal cuts. So when those cuts happened, I saw firsthand in my exam room how my patients were harmed. And I felt quite indignant, and I remember looking around going, someone needs to say something. Like, someone needs to speak up and do something. And it was actually a really horrible feeling when it dawned on me that probably the person best positioned to do that was me. And so I definitely do not do this for fun. I don't do it because I'm any good at it. I do it because I understand that to be part of my responsibility as a physician. And these are some of my colleagues at one of those rallies. And I will say that this advocacy work really united us as a team of colleagues. And our employer was the health authority who made it very clear that any advocacy work had to be done on our own time and completely distinct from our clinical work. So we had all worked that morning, raced downtown, organized this whole rally, and then raced back to clinic in taxis just in time to see our 1 o'clock patients. If you're a healthcare worker who writes, please do not limit yourself to medical and literary publications. I really think we ought to write far more for the general public. You can write online, you can write in newspapers, you can write in magazines, you can write a book for a general audience. So something that prompted me to write this book was the pervasive misrepresentation of refugees in the public discourse. And I saw a prominent narrative and then a counter narrative. So in the main narrative, the refugee serves as scapegoat, onto which we can project our fears of terrorism, our resentment in Canada over high taxes that fund a social security system that benefits the less fortunate, our anxiety over rising numbers of visible minorities. The counter-narrative romanticizes refugees. We love the idea of the rescue of innocent victims, whom we then expect to adopt a lifelong posture of gratitude and indebtedness. As I was writing this book, a friend asked me one day, "Oh, what have you been writing about this week?" And I said, "Racism." And she said, "It's terrible that refugees face that in Canada." And I said, "Yeah, but what I actually find really interesting is that some of my patients are racist themselves." And she said with great finality, "Well, you can't put that in the book." And this idea that something, while true, was completely off limits for any exploration simply because it conflicted with a preferred narrative really bothered me. And so I did write about that in the book. And what I wanted to offer with this book was simply another account. I wanted to show what I saw in my exam room over that decade. And I think of this as gentle advocacy. One deterrent to writing this book was the fear of appropriation. Was I commandeering the refugee experience for my own profit? And even if we argue that this book serves to advocate for this demographic's needs, what about this? You don't need to be a voice for the voiceless, just pass the mic. Well, 80% of my patients needed interpreters for medical visits. So logistically, linguistically, they simply couldn't be interviewed on the radio or write editorials for the newspaper. Second, most of my patients had experiences of persecution and so had every reason to fear authority. And so they perceived speaking up and pushing for change as fraught with risk. And finally, Canadians have expectations about how refugees ought to behave, and complaints of any kind don't fit with those expectations. So I want to read just a couple of paragraphs from my book about one of those rallies. Then I raced back to the clinic in time for my first afternoon patient. It was Yusuf. "I heard you on the radio this morning," he said. I'd been on CBC's early edition with Rick Clough. Yusuf marveled that I could publicly disagree with the government without fear of repercussions. "We want to say thank you for your help," he went on. I was surprised by how closely he had followed our campaign. While I had seen advocacy as distinct from direct clinical care of the patient, something I did off the side of my desk, it was clear that Yusuf saw it differently. "We have made you a Facebook fan page in Arabic," he said. Now, my editor actually told me I should not include that anecdote in the book because she said it jeopardized my likability to readers. But I love that story because that was my confirmation that my Iraqi patients were fine with me holding the mic. So the book came out last September. We're a year in. And has this advocacy worked? Has there been change in response to the book? So let's talk about some of the feedback I've received. And so as not to jeopardize my likability, we'll start with the negative feedback. That was far more interesting. So Stephen left this review on Goodreads. He's mastered the sandwich technique of constructive criticism. And Sarah's review has a spoiler alert, and the spoiler is that I am not a man. So I get a lot of mail about the book, and I've heard from doctors and nurses and lawyers and lots of students I've heard from seniors living in small towns in Canada who have privately sponsored Syrian refugees. And all of these responses make some reference to being moved. People have told me that they see their neighbors differently now, or that they approached a refugee family in their church for the first time. People have written that they want to change their line of work, to engage in something that's more challenging and meaningful. And somebody even sent me this picture from their local bookstore, the book that changed my life. It strikes me that the point of both writing and medicine is to affect change and to point things in the right direction, one patient or one reader at a time. And so no, there has not been change to Canadian refugee policy since my book came out, but I wrote this to move the individual reader. And if I can do that, one reader at a time across the country, then I'm satisfied. So I write to legitimize my patient's suffering. I write to reflect on being a doctor and how that intersects with other spheres of my life, such as motherhood and writing. And I write to advocate for a population who cannot take the mic, who is effectively voiceless, and whose needs are so clear to me as their physician. And there's a fourth reason that I write, although it's not particularly academic. I do write to entertain. And at home with all those kids, I never get to finish a sentence. And at the clinic, I try to let the patient do most of the talking. So to have someone read my book or sit quietly in an auditorium for 40 minutes to let me speak for once is gratifying. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. And if you would stay right there, I think we'll have some questions and comments. And I'm going to turn to Chief Resident Dr. Anthony Peters to start us off.
Thank you so much for that talk. Very powerful and inspiring. We'll take questions, and I can toss one out first. I think for a lot of us, this can be inspiring, but the gulf between jotting down some notes at home and writing a book may seem wide. Could you talk a little bit about your early writing? I know you mentioned the editorials, but that very early writing.
Yeah, and it certainly wasn't just going from nothing to writing the book. I did do a lot of writing over my years at the clinic. And I think sometimes if we try to commit to daily writing or a journal, it becomes overwhelming and we abandon it. But I tried at least once a week to just write down what was memorable that week, not to capture everything, just a couple of things. And the writing I did there, I didn't plan to write a book. I never intended for anyone else to see it. So it was just writing just enough to jog my own memory in case I ever wanted to come back for it. And so when I decided to write the book, going back, and I had thousands of words worth of kind of anecdotes. So it was going through them again and kind of finding the themes and organizing them. And some of the chapters in the book are based on articles or essays that I'd written or even blog posts. So I would suggest like absolutely kind of starting small, writing something, putting it out there, and you learn so much just from putting something out there and seeing what the feedback is. And developing your own writer's voice, I think, takes time.
Thank you. Other questions?
Other questions and comments? And please do identify yourself when you offer your comment or question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Paco. I'm a fourth year Global Public Health and Bioethics minor here. And you were speaking about how to get started with your collection of your anecdotes and your stories and why we should do that. Do you remember when or why you decided to take that next step and publish a book and continue that journey? And then where do you see yourself moving forward after that?
I remember the moment where I knew in medicine that I had to write, that I wanted to write. So I was in medical school at UBC, and for our first year, we were assigned cadavers to dissect. We're in groups of 5, and we each had a cadaver for the entire year. And so we did our work and we had our exam and kind of the year was done. And I remember feeling like there was this whole aspect of that experience that just was not acknowledged in any way, right? So, I mean, I still remember the moment where we lifted the heart out of our cadaver's body and held it and what that felt like. Or I remember there was a Band-Aid on his arm where we were supposed to cut, and all 5 of us were certain that we should not remove the Band-Aid. It was this reminder of his humanity. So it was those kinds of details that just weren't acknowledged at all. So I wrote a poem called Reflections on 7 Months with a Cadaver. I felt a little weird for doing it. But then I read it, we had kind of a talent night. And then I read my poem. And then there was such a great response to it where I realized that I wasn't the only one that recognized that. It kind of resonated with others. And then I submitted it and it was published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. So kind of that's where it started for me. And then that just affirmed that I wanted to do this and there was a need for it. As for writing this book, basically I turned 40 and they say 40 is now or never time. And you start realizing you don't have an infinite amount of time to do things, and it was something I'd wanted to do. And so I was like, okay, I have a few ideas and I'm gonna pick one and I'm gonna see what I can do with it.
Others? Questions?
Hi there, I'm Donna Landon. I'm also a refugee provider for about 3 years now. I'm about halfway through your book, and I've really appreciated how many times I thought, wow, I felt like that too, I just didn't recognize it. So I love that you were able to kind of put that in perspective for me. Also, thank you for making me cry 3 or 4 times during your talk. I would love to, I guess, get your perspective of how you handle boundaries with patients. I had never really considered that maternalistic theory, that maybe that's why I do it as well, but there's often times where I wish I could just move a family into my basement.
Yes.
And I haven't yet, but you know, I've got one patient right now that he needs help, and I don't know who's going to help him. How have you handled that? I'd love your perspective on that.
Like, I think the first step is just recognizing it and kind of teasing it apart and realizing what your own reaction is. I know for me what really helped is once I read the article on the helper-helped distinction, saying, okay, so how can I reduce that distinction between me and my patients? What are some things I can do to narrow that? And it made me look at gift giving in a really different way, for example. So at first, I just did not accept gifts from my patients. And I had an interaction once where the patient was trying to give me a gift and I was refusing, we were going back and forth. And finally he said with real frustration, you don't need to receive a gift, but I need to give it. And then I realized that this was, when you see it in the helper-helped context in terms of obligation, I saw that as his way of trying to narrow that gap and give me something back. And so then I start, I mean, within reason, I will accept gifts from patients now. But that's just one example, right, of trying to find ways of kind of empowering patients. And even like recognizing my patients' kind of vulnerability and their deference and kind of working with them to be more assertive in Canadian society, for example. So yeah, I think kind of taking a more proactive approach to it and finding ways to reduce that gap.
My name's Jake Lick. I'm a clinical research coordinator. I was in the Peace Corps and I've worked with refugees as a teacher as well, but I really enjoyed your talk and especially how grounded and reflective you are. And I'm not a doctor, but I know they're super busy and I'm always trying to find time just to do these kinds of things that you describe, and you really told us all about that, so thank you, like how you did it and worked part-time and stuff like that. And it's kind of counter to our culture in many ways. But I really just wanted to ask you, what was the meaning of the title of the book? I was curious about that.
So I wanted some kind of phrase that I used with patients that also had some reference to the refugee experience. And so, because your heart is the size of your fist, right? So I said this to patients on numerous occasions. And then it just struck me that the gesture of a fist has numerous meanings. So there's this fist of aggression, which most of my patients had faced. But then the fist can also be a sign of strength. And I saw so much of that in my patients as well. So that's where I was going with that title. I had a number of other kind of medical that my publisher told me were just really obscure, and no one outside of healthcare would have any idea what it meant.
Other questions? Other questions? Comments? I'll ask you one as well. Given your strong advocacy of writing, it strikes me that in the American health system, even if we are reducing our numbers of incoming refugees and immigrants, clinics and hospitals all across the country are going to continue to see this population. And you have thoughts about ways in which you might change the training process, the education and training process for physicians and nurses and other caregivers to help us do a better job of preparing to care for these people and helping to integrate them more fully into our society?
That's a tricky one. And so with my own training, there was absolutely no focus at all on refugees. And I only learned of it because of one of my preceptors worked an afternoon a week at the refugee clinic. In Vancouver, because it's so multicultural and diverse, in that sense, it's just kind of integrated into your regular clinical practice. I don't know, and I guess the trouble is it's still a very small part of the population, even in Vancouver, right? So we have modules now. There's been a big focus in the last few years on First Nations, so kind of cross-cultural care in terms of First Nations and trauma-informed care. And so I do find a lot of that, which is now mandatory, does cross over into other vulnerable groups.
Other comments, questions? Would you like to read us another passage from your book, if not to put you on the spot?
I'm not prepared. Does anyone have a passage they'd like me to read? I don't know. I don't know offhand, Marcia. Did you have something in mind?
No, actually, because it was the maternalism things that had struck me, and I had actually assigned that chapter to an undergraduate class last year in anticipation of your visit. But before the program started, we were talking also about the different sets of refugees that have come into Canada, and this was something you had indicated you might want to say a little bit more about that graph.
Oh,
if you would like to do that.
There was, sure. There was anyway, you know how it is, you make a presentation and then you always have to cut some stuff, but then you're secretly hoping someone asks in question period, so you tag it at the end. So Marcia knew I had this graph. No, I find this really interesting. So I didn't know actually until I came out here in March that Canada was so unique with its private refugee sponsorship system. It wasn't until Fern Hawk told me in her clinic, I said, what about the privately sponsored refugees? And she said, oh, we don't have them. And I didn't believe her at first. I had to kind of investigate this. But I find this really interesting because so the gray on this graph is the government-assisted refugees, and then red is privately sponsored refugees. And so what happens, so I find so interesting, is with world events, you can see the Canadian citizens can decide to respond to that. So this started in 1979 with the boat people, right, from Vietnam and Cambodia. And then around the late 80s, early 90s, I believe that was in response to Eastern Europe. And now you can see 2015. If you look at 2016 and 2017, the red is now more than double the gray because there's just been this enormous response from citizens to the Syrian crisis. And then I think what happens, I think when you go out there and you find a couch for a Syrian family, or you're out there trying to find, snow jackets for the kids, I think it just makes you invested in newcomers in a very kind of practical way. And I think all Canadians know someone who's directly involved in resettling a refugee family. So it's less abstract and it's much more kind of real and right there in your backyard.
Thank you. We will take any more comments or questions. We have just a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Martina, if you are able to read some from your book, there's a piece that you have in there about motherhood and medicine and realizing that we want to do both of those things. Do you remember that piece?
Did I write that? I don't. You know what? I don't know what chapter it was, though. Okay, I think it was chapter 6. Let's see if I can. Yeah, I just see the. I see the part where I write about the challenges. Was it that part?
I think that's
or was
what it was.
Sure. So yeah, okay. I'll read a couple paragraphs there about the difficulty of it. Oh yeah. Okay. I was writing about my colleague, who's this 40-year-old single man who would. So watching him hang up his reflective jacket and rummage in his briefcase for a granola bar. This is what he did every morning when he came into work. I could vaguely recall a life where my only real responsibility between waking up and presenting myself at work or school was to put on clothes. Now I could hardly remember what it was like to show up at the office without feeling like I'd already done a full day's work. My colleague had the enviable ability to be single-minded, and that was what I found most difficult about mixing medicine and motherhood, the diffusion of focus. Caring for both patients and children was not easy. I'd attended a medical conference the year before where the presenter had flashed a list onto a giant screen saying, these are attributes of physicians that serve them well professionally: control, perfectionism, competitiveness, dedication, perennial caretaker, emotional remoteness. The audience had nodded and murmured in recognition. He'd continued, and these are the attributes of physicians that are liabilities in family life. He flipped to the next slide. It was an exact replica of the first. I was struck by how neatly my domestic difficulties had just been explained. I'd often noticed that the very qualities that enabled me to do a good job at the clinic frustrated my efforts at caring for my family and our home. My days at work were organized exactly as I liked them, from the length of patients' appointments to their medication list to the position of the stapler on my desk. I interviewed patients, examined them, and ordered investigations. I didn't determine who walked in the door, but I managed every aspect of the problem once it was presented to me. My life at home was an unpredictable, distracted mess. Urgent requests and displaced items greeted me at every turn. I might be the one guiding the day in a general sense, but the 1,000 details were determined by 3 spontaneous children. I thought it was more positive, actually. Like, I have 4 kids now, and they're older, so it's not, this kind of is bringing me back to like a more difficult time. But so I wanted to be a great doctor and even more a great mother, but if the qualities of one could be the undoing of the other, it was no wonder my life felt like such a struggle some days. And then I have my 10 guidelines for work-life balance.
Thank you so much.
My
Martina
pleasure.
Scholtens.